So welcome to our webinar on shareholder activism, a topic that is rarely out of the headlines and affects companies of all different sizes from all different sectors. So first, we're going to start by doing some introductions. I'm Emma Plaxton. I'm a Principal Associate in the corporate team at Mills & Reeve. I'm part of the Equity Capital Markets team, and my clients are mainly listed PLCs. Rachel.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, I'm Rachel McDonald. I'm a partner in the Commercial Disputes Group here at Mills & Reeve, and I have a specialism in shareholder and corporate disputes.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alex Woolgar. I'm a partner in our IP and commercial team. Before I was a lawyer, I was a geography and sustainability person, so I've had quite a long-term interest in the ESG side of shareholder activism for about the last 5 years.
Great. So here is the agenda for this morning. So first, we are going to explain, what is, in a nutshell, is shareholder activism. Then we're going to come on to explore the different motivations of activists. We will give an overview of the legal framework in the UK for shareholder activism and the tools that are available to activists. We will look at some current trends and developments. And we will finish by looking at what companies should be doing to protect themselves. So, what is shareholder activism? Well, it helps to go back to some corporate law basics. So, a company is a separate legal entity which is owned by its shareholders. It doesn't have its own mind. Instead, it has a board of directors to take decisions on its behalf. The directors owe fiduciary duties to the company. And one of the key duties, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is that they promote the success of the company for the benefit of its shareholders as a whole. So there is this separation between the people taking the decisions, the directors, and the owners of the company, the shareholders. And shareholder activism operates in that gap between the directors and the shareholders. And it describes the tools and tactics that are used by shareholders to try and influence the board of the company. So, and just as a sort of, a bit of further background as to shareholder activism in the UK, we used to sort of view it as a sort of import from the US. But it's become more and more prominent and has become a sort of feature, a main feature of the life of listed companies. And one point that is worth bearing in mind is that activism should not automatically be seen in a negative light. So one person's activist is another person's engaged investor. And it can be helpful to try and move away from some of that sort of terminology around battle, campaign, defense, defeat, because it helps us to move towards more of a sort of constructive engagement model. So that's sort of a point to bear in mind as we sort of move through this presentation. So on this slide, we've got a breakdown of key objectives in 2024. So what are activists generally looking for? Well, generally, they're looking for a short to medium term return and will push for a corporate event that delivers that. It's worth bearing in mind that the market may welcome an activist taking a stake in an underperforming company with the expectation that the activist will generate value for shareholders. And yeah, as I said, you can see the breakdown of key objectives in 2024 on this slide. A couple of things to point out. There has been an increase in strategic and operational demands compared to the 3-year average. And M&A remains high on the agenda, and we've seen some high-profile examples of that in 2025. So this slide shows a significant increase in CEO departures following an activist campaign. And it's quite marked, really. There's been a 170% increase since 2020. And I think we can see that increase as being linked to that focus, that increased focus on strategy and operations. So we've got a great live example of an activist campaign that's focused on strategy and operations at the moment in the BP example. So you may well have read in the papers that BP has scrapped its plans to become a major renewable energy player. And this follows news that Elliott Management, a well-known activist fund, has taken a 5% stake in the company, and that makes it BP's third largest shareholder. Last week, the CEO announced a fundamental overhaul of its strategy with a pivot back to oil and gas and a focus on doubling market value by 2030. And there were reports last week that perhaps did not go far enough for Elliott. And I think as a result, yesterday, the chair announced that BP will appoint 2 new directors. One will be focused purely on oil and gas, and the second will take charge of the remuneration committee. And I think we can expect to see those executive remuneration targets realigned to this change in strategy and this focus now back on oil and gas. And that was widely seen as being a move on the part of the chair to preempt one of Elliott's well-known demands, which is a replacement of directors. So M&A activism. So M&A encompasses agitating for a sale of the company itself. And it also encompasses agitating for the sale of particular divisions of the group. So there are 2 high-profile examples from earlier this year. So one is the FTSE 100 conglomerate Smiths Group, which announced a breakup not long after the US activist Engine Capital called on it to split. And hot on the heels of Smiths Group, we had Honeywell, a US conglomerate, announced that it was to split into 3 independently listed businesses. And that was following pressure from Elliott, the same activist that we've seen in the BP example. So it's interesting to note that breaking up conglomerates is a strategy that does much better in more robust M&A environments. And that perhaps reflects a rebound in M&A activity that we're seeing. I'll now pass over to Alex to talk about ESG and activism.
Yeah, so obviously the days of ESG activism go back to Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall taking shares in Tesco to prompt change in how they kept their hens, and even further. So it's been going on for a while, but in recent years, we've seen particular pressure on listed companies to set climate targets, particularly net zero target in 2050 or before. Now that effectively all FTSE companies have net zero targets, the next wave is around trying to put in place a credible transition plan. So the actual how they're going to meet those targets, often the detail is lacking. We've also seen pressure on other forms of ESG outcome, particularly around biodiversity and conservation of late, and then perhaps more traditional resolutions and pressure around issues such as fair and equal pay, executive remuneration, and so on. That's on the one hand. Obviously, it won't have escaped your attention that there's been something of an ESG backlash internationally, particularly in the US over the last few years. So there are activists, Elliott was mentioned, but there are others whose priorities entirely short-term or medium-term value maximization, and they sometimes view ESG factors as antithetical. So companies are coming under opposite pressures in relation to ESG, and it's quite an interesting and tricky landscape to navigate. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks. So this graphic shows the various tools that are available to activists. Now, most of these are legal, and we'll come on to talk about them, but some are non-legal and still very important. So you'll see media there, for example. So the Companies Act gives shareholders a range of rights. For example, you only need 1 share to have the right to attend, vote, and speak at general meetings. So that sort of actually goes back to the Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall example, where I think he took 1 share in Tesco PLC, and that gave him, the opportunity to speak at the Tesco AGM, which was quite a high-profile event. However, it is important to remember that these rights that are given in the Companies Act are given to legal shareholders, not to beneficial shareholders. And that distinction is important because of how shares are typically held in this country. And that's something that we'll come on to talk to later. So the AGM. This is a focal point for the activist shareholder. Public companies must hold an AGM once a year, and there will be ordinary business that is tabled at the AGM. So shareholders will be asked to renew share authorities to approve executive remuneration. But perhaps most importantly, part of the business of the AGM is the annual re-election of directors. And this can be a powerful outlet for shareholder discontent. And this graph shows a sort of the resolutions, number of failed resolutions between 2018 and 2024. And it's interesting that the number of failed resolutions has sort of dropped last year from a peak around the time of COVID and the cost of living crisis. So it's perhaps fallen back down to earlier 2018, 2019 levels. And this is a breakdown by resolution of the failed votes in 2024. So that first one there is the vote against disapplication of preemption rights. And that's often one of the first to fail because it requires a majority of at least 75%. So it's a higher majority than an ordinary resolution. So that is often the first to fail. It's also just worth noting that 5 resolutions relating to the re-election of directors were actually withdrawn. So they weren't put to the AGM, and that's probably because they would have failed had they been put to the AGM. So this slide shows the number of significant votes against executive remuneration. So it's not failed votes, but it's votes against between 20% and just below 50%. And this is an interesting graph because you can see that dissent peaked around the time of COVID and the cost of living crisis, but it's now on something of a downwards trend. And that perhaps reflects improved engagement with shareholders on the issue of executive pay. There's been a lot in the press about it, and perhaps companies and boards are just getting better about engaging with their major shareholders and pitching levels of executive pay. Now, Alex is going to talk about figures relating to ESG resolutions.
Yeah, so very briefly, some interesting research published just at the start of the year by the PRI Principles for Responsible Investment over the last 3 years in a number of jurisdictions, UK, US, Canada, South Africa, Poland, and Denmark. We've seen sort of a relative stability, although a slight increase in the number of ESG related resolutions proposed at AGMs. But what's really interesting is how support for those has fallen off a cliff over time. And it's particularly notable in the context of environmental and social themed resolutions as opposed to governance, where the level of majority support remains relatively, well, not stable, but it's decreased at a much less precipitous rate. Some interesting sort of speculation as to why that might be. It's probably not the case that companies have sorted out all their environmental and social issues. What seems more likely, perhaps, is that activists haven't had vast amounts of success getting those resolutions through with majority support. They're often withdrawn. And governance resolutions often are a little more palatable because they give more flexibility to the board of directors as to how to then implement them as compared to sort of hard environmental or social targets. That said, some have succeeded, and there have been examples of resolutions having been pushed through to stop companies from degrading forest land to turn it into farmland by 2030, for example. I think one other point to note that's not on the slide is of the 2022 resolutions that were successful, almost 80% of them have been implemented in some form in the way in the company's operations, and a further 10% are in the process of being implemented. So there's a bit of a time lag, but if a resolution is successful, then there is then implementation that follows. So it can be a powerful tool, but I wouldn't want to overstate how much power it has in an ESG context. Emma.
So how do you requisition resolutions? One of the most, which Alex has spoken to, requisitioned resolutions, one of the most significant rights under the Companies Act is the ability to requisition a resolution. This can be done at the AGM, and it essentially requires the board to give notice of the resolution to all shareholders and to put that resolution to a vote. So there are two alternative thresholds. One is shareholders holding at least 5% of the total voting rights, or the alternative threshold is at least 100 shareholders, each holding, on average, at least £100 of paid up share capital. So you can see with that second threshold how a shareholder could split their holdings in order to meet that threshold. And requisitioning a resolution generates significant amounts of publicity, even if the vote ultimately fails. So even if the vote fails, that publicity can sometimes be an end in itself. So you don't need to wait for an AGM. Shareholders can require the board to call a general meeting specifically to put their requisitioned resolutions to shareholders. And in a way that can generate even more publicity than tabling additional resolutions at an AGM. So if a company receiving a requisition will probably need to make an announcement to the market that it has received that requisition. And the threshold for this is 5% of the voting rights. However, going back to that sort of word of caution, as with many rights given to shareholders under the Companies Act, this right can only be exercised by a legal registered shareholder. And this slide is intended to illustrate the difficulty here. So it shows the typical ownership structure in the UK where shares are held in Crest. And the important point to note is that the investor's name does not appear on the share register. Instead, it is the nominee that is registered. Now, going back to the requisition, this will need to be signed by the nominee and not the investor. So the investor will often hold their shares through a stockbroker who will pull those shares in a custodian nominee account. And when it comes to signing requisitions, many nominees, as a matter of policy, won't sign a requisition, even if the beneficial shareholder, the investor, requests it. So there are ways around it. You can dematerialize the shares, put them into paper form in the name of an investor, but that takes time, so it needs to be factored in. And it becomes even more complicated when you are talking about depository receipts. So these are issued when English companies have shares listed on a foreign exchange. So, for example, an English company with shares listed on NASDAQ. In this case, the legal registered holder is actually the depository bank that holds the depository receipts and issues shares, it holds the shares and issues depository receipts representing those shares to investors. So all of the shareholder rights that we've been talking about, they are actually vested in the bank. And the bank may be under no obligation to exercise those rights if it's asked to by the investor. And you know, there is an option to convert depository receipts back into shares, but we have heard of a case where that was prohibitively expensive. So the investor had to pay $600,000 to convert his depository receipts into shares, and then $600,000 to convert them back again. So that's $1,200,000 to be able to requisition a resolution. Sort of, you know, puts it in context. So an important tool is stake building. So the advantages of stake building for an activist investor are really twofold. So one, it provides access to those tools under the Companies Act that we've spoken about. And two, if the activist's intention is to increase the share price, which, you know, of course, that is in many cases the aim, that stake should yield a profit. And an important thing to be aware of is that an activist must avoid acquiring 30% or more of the total voting rights, as this will trigger an obligation under the Takeover Code to make an offer for the entire issued share capital. So that's, not something that you want to trip up by accident. And this is the reason why we often see activist investors hovering just below that 30% mark. And this table illustrates why you would want to stake build. So it sets out the different rights that are available under the Companies Act at different thresholds. And I just wanted to draw attention to the more than 25% threshold, because that's quite a significant one. At more than 25%, you can block a special resolution, and you can also block a takeover that is done by way of scheme of arrangement, which most takeovers are done by way of scheme of arrangement in this country. So it's quite a significant threshold. It's also worth bearing in mind that these asterisks, and sorry, it's not on the slide, but that indicates that this is a percentage of those that actually attend and vote at the meeting. So likely turnout needs to be factored in, and activists can have an outsized influence in a company where turnout for general meetings and AGMs is typically low. So that can make a huge difference. And now I'm going to pass over to Rachel, who's going to talk about some of the litigation strategies that can be employed.
Thanks very much, Emma. So we're now getting into the realms of the more litigious areas and looking at the types of formal litigation that shareholders can bring. I think it's worth saying that, we often talk about litigation, formal litigation. Actually, it starts a lot earlier than that, what we call a pre-action phase. So these are the sorts of allegations that can be made in order to try to influence a company to take a different approach. It's not necessary, of course, to bring that sort of formal action. It can actually be used as leverage, and that's how we most commonly see it, these sorts of claims being used as leverage to try to get a desired result for shareholders. But the first one I wanted to talk to you about was bringing an unfair prejudice petition, and that comes from Section 994 of the Companies Act. And you can see the constituent elements up on the slide. And to echo some of what Emma was saying, though, you do need to be a member, or in some cases a former member, to pursue a petition. And therefore, if you're not, then you don't have standing. So very briefly, the remedy of unfair prejudice allows a shareholder to petition the court for an order for relief where the affairs of the company are being or have been conducted in a matter that is unfairly prejudicial to the interests of members, generally, or some part of their members, or there's an actual or proposed act or omission that would be so prejudicial if it was to take place. Now, these actions are typically pursued where there has been some sort of alleged breach of those directors' duties owed to the company, some form potentially of inequitable conduct, and or serious, and I sort of emphasize serious mismanagement, because it's not just the case that you disagree with the decisions that directors have been making. They typically arise in scenarios, for example, where the company is looking to dilute shareholdings, where they're making decisions that benefit directors or other third parties rather than the company, where they're seeking to amend articles of association to the detriment or to prejudice other types of shareholding. And so you can see those scenarios arising, which lead to allegations that particular types of shareholders, typically minority shareholders, have been unfairly prejudiced. And the court has a wide discretion to grant various different remedies. It's worth saying that while we do regularly see these types of claims in practice, they're usually made in private and usually smaller companies. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. As I said, there are a variety of remedies that a court can order, and that can include sort of preventing the company from taking steps, requiring the company to take other steps. However, by far the most common order is an order for sale at fair value. And that fair value is the value that the shares would have been had there been no unfairly prejudicial conduct. So essentially, you may get to the end of an unfair prejudice action and the court may order that the petitioning shareholders are bought out. I think importantly, a few things arise from this, which mean that it's more likely to be useful for private or smaller companies. There's typically less of a ready market for those companies, which makes it much more difficult to quantify the value of shares and also to find someone to buy them. Listed companies, conversely, should have a ready market and a share price, so much easier to quantify the value. And in practice, those shareholders may just cash out, although of course that depends on how much the shareholding value has been deteriorating because of the activities of the company. Finally, just on unfair prejudice, these are very fact-specific and fact-heavy claims, and therefore they are expensive to pursue. So shareholders need to be convinced that it will be worth it in the end if they do push the button to pursue formal claims. In many cases I've worked on, the company in question has actually been in financial distress, and so there wasn't really much to benefit from pursuing an unfair prejudice position because you're essentially making the position worse in terms of potential recovery. But that does, that aside, it goes to show that they can be a useful lever for shareholders in negotiations. So that's unfair prejudice. Moving on to derivative actions. Again, the constituent elements are on the slide. Here, these typically statutory derivative actions derive from Section 260 of the Companies Act. And here we're really looking at claims, usually anyway, against directors for breach of their duties. The most important thing to remember with derivative actions is that this is a remedy and an action that is pursued on behalf of the company. It is not an action that the shareholder pursues directly. And so what that means is that there are several factors in relation to that, but what it means is even if you get to the end of it and you're successful, that remedy is the company's remedy. So any compensation, for example, is the company's compensation. And while you wouldn't directly benefit as a shareholder, you wouldn't get that direct benefit. And the second thing, really importantly, therefore, means that because this is an action pursued on behalf of the company, the shareholder, before it can even start that action or continue that action, needs permission to pursue the claim, and that from the court. And that typically involves two stages. The first stage is considering on paper an application made by the application shareholder. The second stage, if the stage one is successful, is an oral hearing. That process in itself can be very fiercely fought and can involve, hundreds of thousands of pounds in costs even before the litigation has commenced or is allowed to continue and start. Many of you may have followed the Client Earth Shell dispute over recent years, and that case Alex will talk about in a little while, but that was actually knocked out at the first stage because it wasn't specific enough, and the case was too vague. But of course, it got a lot of press coverage before that. I have a derivative action at the moment, albeit with a private company and a disgruntled investor. Again, there is a bit of a cottage industry in respect of that getting permission phase, and you can often be several rounds of submissions down before you've even started. And that case started 6 months ago, and we're still at stage one. So derivative actions, useful, but not going to give you that direct. You're not going to give shareholders that direct remedy. Then looking at sections 90 and 90A of the Financial Services and Markets Act. Now, these are for public companies only. Section 90 will grant shareholders who have suffered loss because of untrue or misleading statements in a prospectus a right to be compensated. Now, there are sort of differences and similarities between Section 90 and 90A. Key differences are that this is in relation to statements made in a prospectus only, but that there's no need to show reliance by the shareholder on that prospectus in question in order to recover losses. So you've got a sort of narrow one document that you can use on which shareholders can use to base their claims, but they don't need to establish reliance. Section 90A is slightly broader in terms of it applies to announcements and other public information that the company has put out. However, in order to recover losses, shareholders would need to be able to show that they relied on those statements, usually in purchasing the shares, and then suffered losses as a result. And that can be really quite challenging, I think, that reliance part. But under both sections, of course, the compensation is paid directly to the shareholder and not to the company, as would be the case in a derivative action. So that's section 90 and 90A. I'll just pass over to Alex to talk about a few cases over recent years.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, very briefly, what this table hopefully shows is that there's been a little bit of an acceleration in section 90 and 90A claims in the UK, largely probably triggered by the establishment of a successful claim in 2022, the autonomy litigation, HP autonomy, which many of you will be familiar with. And since then, we've had 3 socially driven ESG claims issued. There are others which aren't ESG related. And the first of which actually we've just realised was settled late in 2024. It's buried deep in Petrofac's announcement regarding its restructuring, that there has been a successful claim, or at least there is some form of compensation that's going to be paid to the shareholders behind the claims. What's the relevance of this to shareholder activism? You may be wondering. Well, I think if you are an activist shareholder that's seeking to promote better ESG outcomes of whatever form, and you're presented with the opportunity to join a Section 90 or 90A claim against a company, and it's relatively de-risked because of the way the claim's put together, you probably would join it because it, best case scenario, you get some compensation out of it. Worst case scenario, it will help to put pressure on companies to think more carefully about what they're doing on the ESG side and how they're communicating that to shareholders transparently and openly. There's no sign of this slowing down. There are a lot of claimant law firms that are actively looking for claims, and there's a very large amount of litigation funding capital, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion, available to fund various types of claim, including these in the UK. And we'd expect institutional shareholders to continue to join these claims as they did in the case of the 3 ESG claims mentioned at the bottom of the table.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we just wanted to also mention a bit about non-legal strategies. So we've been talking largely about legal strategies, but it's important to recognise that the non-legal strategies that will be employed. So there'll be private engagement with the board, often before or completely instead of, hopefully, any sort of public engagement. There will be eliciting the views of other shareholders, and if that doesn't work, there might be the publishing open letters, conducting press campaigns. So these non-legal options, they can really pile on the pressure. That said, they don't compel a company to do anything, unlike some of the legal strategies we've been talking about. So we find that these non-legal, softer options are often combined with the formal threat of legal actions to act as a sort of threat in case the company doesn't engage. So we're now going to talk a little bit about some key trends and developments for the coming year. And one that I wanted to pick up was M&A activity. So I think as we do have a rebound in M&A activity, I think we will see a further increase in transactional based activism. So I think there will be more pressure on companies to divest, spin off parts of their business. And I think that in some cases, shareholders, because of companies being undervalued on the stock market, shareholders will pressure companies perhaps to seek a take private transaction or to put themselves up for sale. And where there's increased M&A activity, I think we'll see increased opportunities for, and forgive the jargon here, the so-called bumpitrage, which is where an activist takes a stake in a company that is subject to a takeover offer and then agitates for a price increase. It might privately agitate for that increase to the board of the target, but it also might go quite public about how it thinks that the consideration undervalues the company. And Alex, I think you're going to talk about some ESG trends.
Yes. So we've sort of touched on most of these already. We are seeing in ESG related claims, including the Client Earth litigation against Shell, that significant institutional shareholders are actually lending their support increasingly to these claims. So institutional shareholders, I think, with aggregate holdings of about 450 billion across their portfolios, supported the Client Earth litigation, and that included Danish pension funds and the pension fund of London local authorities, so some reasonably significant players. But then, of course, we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, a bit of an ESG backlash. BlackRock was led by Larry Fink, previously very much the vanguard of ESG in investment decisions and the way in which they held and made decisions around their investments. They came under significant pressure by mainly red states in the US and their pension funds to ameliorate their ESG approach, and they have done so, although they do continue to invest significant sums in long-term environmentally sustainable projects like carbon capture and storage in the many multiples of billions. The other thing that we're seeing, and this is a little bit along the lines of Client Earth and Shell, is an increasing sort of creative claims brought by activists, not necessarily using the shareholder mechanics. Interesting research from the Grantham Institute in 2023 around the impact of ESG litigation being brought, just the fact of it being brought caused a drop in share price as compared to expected value. What was particularly interesting was that drop in share price was about 3 times greater, where the claim was a relatively unusual claim, as if the market couldn't price it or understand exactly what the likely ramifications were. So that's obviously, even if a claim is legally challenging, if it has legs, then that's an interesting approach, maybe from activists, to put additional pressure on public companies. Also, we might see more non-judicial routes. So you may be familiar with the UK's national contact point, and there are other national contact points around the world that administer the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct. UK signed up to it. Many other OECD countries have too, and that's effectively a way of publicly litigating and getting a sort of judgment against multinational enterprises if they haven't kept to what are considered good ESG practices. And there's been an increase of those claims in the UK. Just passing on now to Rachel.
Thanks, Alex. I just wanted to mention and put on people's radars the new corporate offence of failing to prevent fraud, which is coming into force in September this year, because I think there's a real prospect that this is particularly relevant to sort of Section 90A issues, i.e. making publishing statements that may be untrue or misleading. So the new failure to prevent fraud offence is sort of similar but potentially broader in scope because it applies to different types of fraud. It's similar to the failure to prevent bribery offence, which came in sort of 10, 15 years ago now. Essentially, under the new offence, a large organisation, as all public companies will be, may be guilty of an offence if an employee, agent or other associated person commits fraud intending to benefit the organisation, and there were no reasonable fraud prevention measures in place. You can see there that there's a potential issue here with providing full and accurate information to shareholders and other third parties. And and what you're publishing in particular. And that's going to become all the more critical, because if you publish something that is later found to be misleading or untrue, there could be potentially significant and criminal consequences from failing to do so. So you're not only looking at potential sort of civil claims from shareholders, but you're looking at potential corporate offences. So those statements that need to be accurate, and not misleading or false in any way. I should absolutely emphasise, this doesn't enable shareholders to bring additional claims against companies in respect of this offence. What it does mean, though, is I think there is a sort of mischief that can be caused with shareholders raising these concerns that have potential criminal consequences, lobbying companies, for example, to investigate and wondering whether they've considered those consequences, and potentially even approaching relevant regulators if they have concerns. So it's another point of potentially a point of leverage when that offence comes in.
Thanks, Rachel. So what can companies do? Alex, you're going to talk a little bit about horizon scanning and just watching for those emerging trends.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, the fact that you're here listening to this webinar, I think, demonstrates that you're bought into the value of horizon scanning. We would certainly advocate structured horizon scanning, not just in relation to legislation, but also in relation to litigation trends and obviously shareholder activism trends more generally. It helps you spot what's coming and respond more proactively and less reactively. And in our experience, and probably yours too, reactive responses tend to be more challenging and more expensive. So we definitely advocate for a structured program of horizon scanning if you don't already have that, and then thinking about how governance wraps around that in more generally, which I think we'll come on to talk about.
Thanks. What we would also encourage boards to do is to consider the company's particular risk areas. And there is an old saying that companies should think like an activist. Trite as that sounds, I think that is still very much true. Companies should try and be their own activist. Companies should be considering what changes might an activist seek. Is there a case for a sort of a return of value there? Are there businesses that don't quite fit with the company's strategy, or are non-core or otherwise underperforming? And then the board should think about how it can defend its strategy to a potential activist, and how it can articulate that strategy. And that exercise should ultimately help boards to engage with shareholders and make sure that their strategy is well communicated and well understood. And I'll hand over to Rachel now.
Sure, just picking up on what Emma was saying there about governance, and this is clearly very high level, but never underestimate the importance of having that effective board with sufficient challenge and independence, particularly coming from the chairman. I think there are two, from a litigator's perspective anyway, there are two real benefits to that. The first is, of course, that you're sort of making the right decisions and thinking about the right things at the right time in the first place, which should hopefully reduce the risk of challenge. But the second, and this is where the litigator's angle comes in, is that you are sort of able to demonstrate that you did think about it correctly and there was sufficient challenge, so at board level, so that if shareholders raise concerns, you have a proper record of what's been said and thought about. And I think to echo in terms of shareholder engagement, to echo what Alex and Emma have been saying, prevention is certainly better than cure. Now, if you're talking to me about, defense of unfair prejudice or derivative actions, things have gone some way down the track, and it's easier to head things off at the pass. And that involves not treating shareholders, necessarily as the enemy, but helpful additive stakeholders. listening to them, anticipating how they might think, as Emma said, to make sure that decisions are trailed and land well. And also, you know, not just when you're in those tricky situations or you're thinking about making big changes, but actually on a sort of day-to-day basis, ensuring that your ongoing engagement is productive as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And then a slightly obvious one, but day-to-day monitoring. As you will be aware, there are mandatory disclosures that shareholders need to make under the disclosure and transparency rules. So under DTR 5, shareholders must disclose their percentage of voting rights if that percentage exceeds or falls below 3%, and then every 1% after that. So it's just keeping track of your significant shareholders, and you know, and being interested in who your significant shareholders are. There is a lot of information that is available to a company for that proactive engagement. And I think we've got some time for questions now. So I'm going to sort of read out some questions that we've got from the Q&A box. And one of these is, can an activist bring value to the company? And perhaps I'll answer this, and then it'd be interesting to hear Alex's perspective from an ESG perspective as well. I think this goes back to you know, not necessarily seeing activists in a negative light. I mean, there are a range of activists, as we've spoken about, with different motivations. Many activists would argue that they are trying to increase value for shareholders. That's what they're doing. And some activists see themselves as almost quite akin or a substitute for private equity, in that they can suggest strategic and operational improvements to improve the company's long-term value. You know, much better for shareholders that way, because then all shareholders benefit from that uplift in value, as opposed to you know, a private equity firm taking over the company and then making those changes and benefiting from that increase in value. So yeah, it's definitely the case that activists can bring value. I suppose there's a sort of tension there where an activist perhaps pursues a very short-term agenda if it's wanting a buyback or a dividend, because there you can see that the board you know, might well have different strategies for the use of that cash and would prefer to reinvest it in the company. But I'll move to you, Alex, because I suppose the ESG activism is very much about long-term value.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'd echo what you said, Emma, very much. I think it sort of depends a bit on the time horizon. I suppose a very short-term activist creating a lot of smoke and fury in a short period of time is only likely to be a distraction, and that has to be factored in terms of the long-term value of a company, whether that short-term, you know, distraction actually is in the company's long-term best interests. I don't know. As to, I mean, it certainly can bring value to a company. Maybe I'd reframe the question slightly and think more broadly from an ESG perspective about societal value more generally. And companies are obviously meant to pay attention to broader elements of value that the Companies Act now for some time. But we have a real issue translating that into practice. There has been some legal progress in terms of greater transparency reporting, but probably what's really needed is a slightly more clear-eyed perspective on the value of the natural and other resources, the capital that companies consume and what they turn that into, which is not a very helpful answer in terms of can activists bring short-term, can activists bring value? They absolutely can, but whether they bring long-term societal value, I'm not really sure. If we look at the BP case study as an example, perhaps, or Shell as well, I think there are questions that have to be asked in terms of their short-term strategy versus long-term outcomes, both for investors and for society as a whole.
And then I've got another question. This is probably one for Rachel. So activists often when they go public, they can say they can sort of do and say whatever they want. Essentially, it feels like that, whereas the company has to necessarily be quite guarded in how it defends himself. Is there anything that the company can do in terms of what activists are saying in public?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, isn't it? I think it can be difficult. We do relatively regularly get approached by companies to say, this statement has been made, it's false, it's exacerbating the situation. Can we bring a claim, for example, in defamation? In those circumstances, you're looking to see, firstly, whether you can attribute that statement to anyone, because often they're made on online platforms where it might be made anonymously, in which case there's no one, you can't prove who's made that statement, even if you have a very good idea who has done. But also you're looking at the sort of limbs of defamation, which can include, whether it's a statement of opinion rather than a statement of fact, and of course whether there's truth in it, in which case, depending on what's being said, that may mean the claim isn't possible. But I think there's a sort of wider consideration there as well, which we often talk about with clients, which is, yes, someone's made an unhelpful statement. If you come out strongly against potentially a key shareholder, or you seek to make claims about defamation, actually, are you sort of adding fuel to the fire there? How is that going to play out? Is it actually going to elongate the tail on statements that have been made and draw more attention to them? So whilst I totally appreciate, and we always appreciate, how frustrating it is when you feel like shareholders are, saying things and can say what they want. Thinking about the sort of actual objectives of taking action and how you do that needs to be borne in mind as well. And often, that sort of proactive or approach to shareholders about what they're saying, and saying, well, actually, is this helping anyone, you making these sorts of statements? And that sort of informal approach can produce better results.
And then I've got another question, which actually, Alex, you sort of touched on. But what happens when a company is faced with activists who have competing demands? It's this sort of concept of the company being pulled in two directions. I think we saw that last year with Reckitt, as we're seeing more activists actually coordinating and coming together to sort of campaign and push to exert influence. It can be quite difficult for a company if those activists are not completely or exactly aligned in, for example, how they think the company should change its strategy, or what measures the company should take. And I can only say that I think it is a challenge for companies. And then even more extreme is perhaps in the ESG sphere, where you might have two different camps with very different ideas on the direction a company should take. Alex, I don't know if you've got any further thoughts.
Yeah, it is really challenging. I agree with you. I suppose perhaps the proactivity is important, and having a clear strategy, by which I mean not just a aspirational goal as to climate targets, but also a clear idea of how you're going to get there. And if your strategy is, well, we're aiming for net zero by 2050, but we're going to extract every last drop of oil before then, and then reinvest it in renewables on this time frame, at least then there's clarity around which the debate can form. And that might then make it a little easier to navigate through those disagreements of opinion differences of opinion before, or hopefully not during, an AGM. But no, there are undoubtedly differing views, and frankly, I suppose those who have greater firepower financially and legally, and the Elliots of this world are likely to win those battles, if it comes to it. But there's no real advice other than try and be clear about what you're trying to achieve, and do the hard work behind that in terms of looking at the science-based targets and understanding what actually is going to have to happen in terms of emissions to reach those objectives. And I'm sure similar things can be said about social objectives, but slightly easier to look at it from a well-trodden path of climate objectives.
And then a final question we'll take is, what is your top tip for dealing with an activist? And I think this is probably quite perhaps obvious from the presentation, what I will say, and perhaps what Rachel and Alex would say. But I think it's really about the thinking like an activist, and having a sort of well-defined, clear strategy, and making sure you engage with shareholders so that they understand that strategy and that you can defend that strategy. So it comes down to, I think, heading it off at the pass, and the old adage that prevention is better than cure.
Yeah, agreed. Obviously, if your current shareholders are happy, they won't sell their shares to activists or lend them to activists.
Great. Well, I think since we are pretty much at time, I'd just like to thank you all for attending this webinar. And as I said, do let us know if you have any feedback. And also on the slide there, we have a guide to shareholder activism on our dedicated shareholder activism webpage. So you can scan the QR code there. That should take you to the guide, which is an overview of the legal framework in the UK and the tools and tactics that are available to activists. So hopefully that is a helpful resource for you. Yeah, thank you very much for attending.